Who would you say is the best anime studio right now? Most people would probably say Mappa, but here's why that's not true. Well, let me rephrase that before everyone misquotes me and tries to tell me that I think Mappa sucks. Which I don't. I mean, they gave us JJK, Chainsaw Man, and Vinland Saga Season 2. Obviously, they deserve the hype. But that's kinda my point. Because they've become so hyped up for a while now, it's gotten to a point where people tend to forget all of the other great studios. Especially in a climate where there's usually several great anime each season rather than one that completely dominates the season. And don't get me wrong, Mappa still manages to stand out each season. But you know who I think is even better? David Productions. And the reason I bring this up now is because right now we have JJK, probably Mappa's biggest anime, and Undead Unluck, Dave Pro's newest project. Now, let me just say this right away. I will admit that I'm biased. I actually happen to like the Undead Unluck manga better than the JJK manga. But even when you look back on all of their other recent projects, there's a few reasons why Dave Pro is currently the best anime studio out right now. But rather than just say it, let's pick this apart and explore why this is the case. Now, before I do that, let's set some ground rules for this discussion. First of all, we're only going to consider anime in the last 5 years or so. A, because anything further back isn't exactly recent, and B, because when I say current, I mean right now, as of recent. I don't mean best of all time, because that's a different discussion entirely. Now, I'm also going to include a bunch of other studios because it's only fair when the conversation is best anime studio and there's so many different anime coming out besides whatever Dave Pro and Mappa are making. So, when we're having this discussion, I think it comes down to about 9 studios. Mappa and Dave Pro obviously, then Bones, Trigger, Ufotable, A1, Wit Studio, Cloverworks, and Madhouse. There are other studios that could be included, but I think most people would agree that these are the big ones. So now the question is, okay, how do you talk about which is the best? Because the simple answer is whatever you want. Like if you like Madhouse because of one season of one show it did, then that is totally valid. It's whatever you enjoy the most. But for the sake of constructive conversation, there's 3 different criteria you can look at. One way to look at it is roster. So like, how many anime are you making, right? Because if a studio's making a ton of anime, then by default that makes them kind of a big deal. Another thing to think about is the actual quality of those anime, because think about which you would prefer. A studio that makes a bunch of okay anime, or a studio that makes one killer anime once a year or so. Now, those are the 2 most people would think of right away. But one last thing people should also consider is impact on the industry. Things like what kind of presence do they have in the mainstream? How much money are they making? How are they changing the industry? So like I said, there's 9 studios that I think everyone should talk about in this kind of discussion, but we can also knock out the other 7 fairly quickly. And I'll start with the hot take and go with Ufotable first. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, you know why you can knock out Ufotable? Because in the last 5 years, all they've done is Demon Slayer. Massive impact on the industry and beautiful anime, but that's literally all they do. They do Fate, and they do Demon Slayer. That is it. Another one we can knock out pretty quickly, Cloverworks. And all I have to say for that one is Wonder Egg Priority and Promised Neverland. They did make a comeback in the last few years, but clearly they are way too hit or miss. Another one we can knock out, Studio Bones. They do have Mob, but My Hero is hit or miss, and they've been kinda doing the same 3 anime for the last few years. Okay, so that's those 3. Now let's talk about the other studios that are all really good, but not quite on the same level as Mappa and Dave Pro. Trigger is obviously one we have to talk about, especially after the Cyberpunk anime. Trigger is a studio that at this point is a pretty safe bet whenever they come out with something new. They have their ups and downs, but they're usually on point. I think the only thing that holds them back is the fact that they kind of come and go. Like, they are consistent and they do have a bunch of iconic anime, but they have a pretty small roster when you really look at it, and they're not exactly dominating every season. As a matter of fact, they really haven't done anything in the last year or so. However, I still think they're great, and I think the Dungeon Meshi anime is gonna be a big hit. But I think we can knock out Trigger for now. And then A1, Wit, and Madhouse we can knock out basically because they're not as mainstream. They are mainstream, in fact, they're very mainstream, but when you really look at their work in the last 5 years or so, they're kind of as mainstream as Dave Pro, but they're definitely not as mainstream as Mappa. The one exception is obviously Spy Family, but that's a hard one to talk about because you have a couple of studios working on that. Now, like I said, it's all very close, especially with those last 4, but hopefully you can see why Dave Pro and Mappa stand out the most. Well, at least for Mappa, anyway. Which brings us to the meat and potatoes of this conversation. So you have Mappa, who most people would probably argue is king right now, and then you have Dave Pro, who a lot of people like and most people will concede that they make great anime, but they're not as massively hyped up as Mappa at the moment. So the question is, based on our criteria, who is the better studio? Well, impact isn't really a good parameter because both studios have each had a massive impact on the industry. Mappa for the obvious reason that it's made the most popular anime for the last 3 years or so, and Dave Pro because it's produced iconic shows like JoJo's and Fire Force. They're both really popular, so it's not all that helpful to go down that rabbit hole of who's the most popular. That just leaves us with roster and quality, which, in my opinion, is really the foundation of this whole topic. If you are of the opinion that great rosters make great anime studios, then clearly Mappa is the better studio. Since 2018, all Dave Pro has really done is JoJo's and Fire Force. It's done other series, but nothing that really stands out all that much besides Urusei Yatsura. Meanwhile, Mappa has done Banana Fish, Zombieland Saga, Dororo, The God of High School, JJK, Attack on Titan, Tact OP Destiny, Chainsaw Man, Vinland Saga, and a dozen other projects. Their work product is insane, and for the most part, they're spot on with each of their productions. So in a pure numbers game, Mappa is clearly the better studio. Dave Pro has like 2 good series in the last 5 years, and Mappa has like 5 times that. But I have just one problem with that. If you look at it that way, we're really just reducing things to a numbers game. Like I said earlier, it's nice to have a lot of good titles, but would you rather have that, or a handful of amazing ones? Now, don't get me wrong, I love Mappa anime. JJK, Chainsaw Man, and Vinland Saga are all gorgeous. I mean, the most recent episode of JJK proves that. And so aren't the Dave Pro anime. In fact, I think we can pretty much all agree that they're both god tier in the animation department. But there's just something about Dave Pro that sets it apart. It is better quality in a sense, but it's also just a stylistic difference. Like, for example, look at the manga Mappa takes on versus the ones Dave Pro takes on. Mappa has taken on the dark trio of shonen manga, and that's generally their MO. They go for the super serious big hit title, like Vinland Saga, like AOT. Again, this is in the last 5 years. Now, compare that to JoJo's and Fire Force. These 2 series couldn't be any further from that. JoJo's is a historically niche series that, while mainstream now, is known for its goofy humor and memes. Fire Force is another show that has a lot of dumb humor and is generally a lighthearted series. And that's really the difference. Mappa series have plenty of comedy, but Dave Pro series are a lot more lighthearted and they're goofier. Now, obviously they didn't create these series, those are just their respective MOs. But it's also just the vibes of Mappa shows versus Dave Pro shows. So, for example, Mappa did each of the Dark Trio. Me personally, by the time I got to Hell's Paradise, I felt like these 3 were a bit samey. I don't have, like, any objective reason for this. It's kind of just the way the scenes are drawn, how the characters are drawn. Like, they're 3 manga with 3 different artists, but I can't help feeling like the 3 anime kind of look the same. They clearly stand out from each other, but I just can't shake that feeling. So you lose a bit of personality in the translation from manga to anime. Meanwhile, Dave Pro is practically defined by personality. Each of its shows could not look and feel more different, and there's a few reasons for this. For starters, each adaptation is faithful to the source material and its art style. I mean, people have even critiqued JoJo's Part 3 for looking too much like the manga. By extension, they also take efforts to retain the spirit of each series. So Fire Force, for example, is a series that isn't afraid to be goofy. And you can see this in the anime with plenty of deadpans and scenes where the characters are being literal crackheads. But where Dave Pro anime stands out the most is in the sound, both the OPs and soundtrack as well as the sound design. Granted, Mappa OPs are amazing, but they're not nearly as iconic as any of the JoJo's OPs. And everyone knows the Fire Force OPs are awesome, but that's not nearly as great as the sound design. One thing I've come to love more and more about Dave Pro is how deliberate they are with sound design. For example, even in JoJo's alone, they take great care to ensure each part looks and sounds different. Listen to the rush of punches from Jotaro in Part 3, Josuke in Part 4, and Giorno in Part 5. You'll notice that they all sound different. As a result, 3 similar attacks each give you a completely unique feeling. This also happens in Fire Force. In a series where everyone does fire attacks, you'd think it would be near impossible to make each of them feel different. But just like with JoJo's, Dave Pro focuses on the little details and emphasizes those small differences. Whether it be the lighting of a cigarette or an Adela burst that sounds like an air horn being blown right behind your head. There's a bunch more I could list, but I don't want to belabor the point. My point is that both studios are great, and if it's a numbers game, then sure, Mappa is king. And you may even like Mappa stylistically more than Dave Pro. But when you've watched the anime from both studios and really paid attention to them, Dave Pro just has more personality. Each of its shows feels entirely unique. They all have a lighthearted tone and a style of humor that stand out from each other. And the sound design of each show helps them to look and feel completely different. So, would I say Dave Pro is categorically better than every other studio? No. Would I say it's objectively better than Mappa? Again, no. But based on those 3 criteria, I really do find myself feeling a special kind of love for the shows they produce. So, for all of those reasons, that's why Dave Pro is still my favorite studio. But what do you think? Did I present a fair argument, or did I basically just talk out of my butt? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my recent video on JJK. In that video, I talk about the importance of the upcoming fight between Ouji and Sukuna. You can find that in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.